and thank you everybody for coming down to see us tonight. 9/11 is a day that will forever be etched in the minds of everyone who lived through it. It is a day those closest to the event remember day after day. Every year for the past 20, the Commack community has paid tribute to the people who were lost, as well as the first responders who sacrificed their safety for others and ran towards danger. Our community has come together year after year unlike no other. Together, we built a memorial. We planted survivor trees in honor of those we lost. We brought in the Stephen Siller Tunnel to Towers 9/11 Never Forget mobile exhibit this past Independence Day. The survivor trees are in honor of those who lost their lives to post-9/11 illnesses. The memorial, dedicated September 11, 2012, holds steel that would have supported stairs at one of the towers. To us, it symbolizes a stairway to heaven. Our own high school students created the words engraved on this stone base. This memorial honors the bravery and sacrifice of our everyday heroes and represents the determination of our community to never forget. Alongside the memorial are over 500 engraved pavers which exemplify the remembrance message of the memorial. The World Trade Center, the epicenter of the attacks in New York, epitomized the economic strength and cultural diversity of New York City. The two towers were a city unto itself where people beautifully coexisted regardless of race, heritage, culture, language, or religion. That legacy was shattered on 9/11 for everyone in New York and in the Commack community. The following are recollections, memories, and histories of our community members of 9/11 and the days, weeks, and years after. Our first impressions come from our 2001 school-age students who lost their innocence because of these terrorist attacks. The first will be shared by Dakota Spiel and Ava Mahoney.
September 10th, 2001. Another ordinary day for my 11-year-old self. School, homework, practice, softball, and work on my sketches so that one day I could be a fashion designer. That night before dinner, my dad and I had a catch on the front lawn. We would throw the ball often while catching up on each other's day. That day, he told me that tomorrow he had a meeting in the Twin Towers. He knew how much I loved the sight of the Twin Towers and the Empire State Building every time we went into New York City. He did not work in the Twin Towers, he just happened to have a meeting in the building that morning. That night, we had dinner together as a family. Life was good in Commack, New York. September 11, 2001. That morning I went to school. I just started the 6th grade as a student in Commack Middle School. I walked into my English class and was catching up with my best friend, Vicky.
9 a.m., the classroom phone rings. One of the students had been called out of the class to go home. His parents were coming to pick him up. You could tell it was unexpected and he wasn't sure why he was getting picked up. We all sighed at how lucky he was to be getting out of class. About a minute later, the phone rings again. Another student was being called down to go home. Again and again and again, throughout the day, about 15 students were pulled from the class with parents picking them up out of school, and not one of them was expecting to be picked up and didn't know why. We knew something wasn't right. This was not normal, but we had absolutely no idea why. 9th period, I go to science class. We all sit down as the bell rings to start class when the principal gets on the announcement system and starts addressing what is left of her students. She covered the timeline of events that occurred, and that at 10:28, the North Tower had collapsed. My heart sank to the bottom of my body as I ran out of the classroom to the bathroom, knowing that my dad was in the World Trade Center. As the day ended, I walked out of school praying that my family was there to pick me up like they always always do. My dad was there. Both of my parents came to pick me up from school that day. I ran into his arms crying, thanking God that I still had my dad. On the car ride home, my dad explained to me what was going on and that he was on the Brooklyn Bridge when it happened. During that car ride home at 11 years old, with the dreams of being a fashion designer, I told my dad that I was going to join the military. My dad returned to Ground Zero multiple times in the week following to assist as a civilian first responder with his prior mining experience and equipment to do whatever he could to help find people buried in the rubble. I remember him coming home covered in gray soot and putting all of his clothes into a bag outside as my mom helped him clean off. Life as we knew it would never be the same. Michelle Mudge, Commack High School class of 2008.
Mudge, as she was affectionately known, was merely a sixth grade student, and the course of her life was changed forever, as was that of Michael Porfidio, a fifth grader, and a CHS class of '09 graduate, which is presented by Jack Martin.
I woke up, ate breakfast, and walked to school. I had just started fifth grade. I remember the principal walking into my class and pulling my teacher to the side as she started to cry. The next thing I remember was getting told that myself and my little sister were being picked up at school by my aunt. As I walked to the office, I could see that there were a lot of kids being pulled out early and that people working in the office were very upset. We eventually got back to my aunt's house and she had the news on, like I'm sure everybody else in the country had at that time we watched. We saw the first World Trade Center with a huge hole on fire. As we were watching more and more with my aunt, we see the second tower get hit. I remember we had gotten a phone call right after that from my dad. At the time, my father was a 10-year veteran with the NYPD in Manhattan. It was a phone call that I have not and will never ever forget. He told me that he loved me and my sister and that he had to go and try and help people that were hurt. I remember crying and begging him not to go, but it was too late as he was already in the city. Hours later, my aunt and my uncle took me and my sister out in their boat as we went to the Hudson River. The whole city was covered in smoke, and I knew my father was in there somewhere. Luckily, he came home 3 days later. We were excited to get to talk to him, but I remember he sounded very depressed. I remember asking my dad who did this, and his reply was that they were bad guys who wanted to hurt Americans. From that point, I decided what I was going to do when I got older.
Our first responders put everything aside to be there for the people of New York City. The Commack Fire Department and Commack Ambulance Corps mustered what they could, with ambulances sent to Shea Stadium, hopefully to evacuate the injured. That unfortunately never happened. In the words of Ed Monahan of the Commack Fire Department, on the morning of 9/11, I had just finished working a 24-hour tour at Special Operations FDNY. I was talking to Chief John Moran and realized I had to get home. I said goodbye to John, and little did I know that those would be the last words I would ever speak to him. Within the next hour and a half, FDNY Special Ops would lose over 100 of its firefighters in the collapse of the towers. I offered the services of Commack Fire Rescue, and with the help of Chief John Engberg, we delivered a rescue truck and 6 well-trained firefighters. We were the first outside rescue team at the scene around 1 p.m. They spent countless hours conducting search operations. Chief Engberg also provided a ladder truck that was sent to Jamaica to provide support for the city. That night, there were 2 structure fires in New York City, one in the Bronx and one in Jamaica. Ladder Company 1 was the first on the scene. The Commack Department rescue responders, Joe Valvano, Joe DeJose, Kieran Keene, Dave Pendola, Frank Caputo, and Bill Week. The Ladder Company responders, Angelo Sanziri, Bob Jinks Sr., Vincent Zuppo, Bud Connolly, Jack Raycraft, Bob Murtaugh, and Joe Badamo, who sadly lost a battle with a World Trade Center illness less than 2 years after, and was the first Commack firefighter to die in the line of duty. Stephen Gowhan delivers the recollection of the days of James Rodder, United States Marine Corps, NYPD, retired.
On the morning of September 11th, I was awoken by a call by my sister. She was informing me that the first tower had been hit. My wife and I put on the TV and watched as they reported the second tower being hit. Life for me at 38 years old, with 16 years on the NYPD, had changed forever. I listened to reports that all members of the NYPD were being ordered into work. The news, not my boss, was telling me to go to work. It reported that approximately 78 NYPD officers were missing, and that number could go higher. As powerful a statement as that was, I was not deterred. I was like a man rushing to go on a trip, going over 101 things in my head and with my wife. She was 3 months pregnant with twins, and she had 3-year-old twins to take care of. I was leaving her with absolutely no idea of what I was going to, and absolutely no idea when I would be coming home. By the time I got to downtown Manhattan, it was nighttime, but that really didn't make much of a difference. The smoke over most of lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn was so thick the sun could not penetrate it. I remember hearing jets overhead, but couldn't see them. I remember a smell that I got to know all too well over the next 4 years, and more impactful than all of this was the silence. Amidst all the chaos were some brilliant people. People and machines were doing what they could for many hours already. They all had this understanding that I was not aware of yet. As I approached the east side of Ground Zero, near many buildings 20 stories and higher, I was unaware the building I was now standing next to was feared to be next to collapse. At that moment, I started to hear whistles blowing, then horns, and then those powerful horns that large construction vehicles and trucks have, all sounding off, and everyone was running right toward me, and then past me. Those horns were telling me and everyone they had reasons to believe the building was going to collapse right then and there. I realized this myself and thought, where do I go? If I ran west, I'd fall right into the pit of Ground Zero. If I ran south, I'd be running into everyone else. The building that was soon to fall, though it never did, was to my east, and I finally realized I should just follow everyone else and run north. I did all for naught, but it still put a fear into me. This happened again in a few weeks, when I was down in the pit and I heard the whistles again. But this time, it was not for fear of another building collapse. It was because someone thought they heard a person calling for help from inside a void in the pile. Again, whistles became horns, horn beats became louder horns, and suddenly what sounded like an incredibly loud air raid siren, then silence. All trucks were turned off, responders stopped moving, generators were turned off, and everyone listened. I could hear a man calling for help. He was a rescue person who fell into a void and was stuck about 1 story below. Once it was realized he was okay, the noise started again. That silence stays with me, and to this day, I call it the loudest silence I have ever heard. On day 8, I was transferred to the command known as the NYPD think tank, OMAP. It was tasked with creating the NYPD DNA database that was to be used to identify bodies and body parts. It was later used for many other things as well, like identifying false claims and identifying found property. I met Detective Tom Neal, a fellow Commack resident, for the first time upon arriving at OMAP. He too was transferred to OMAP to create this database. It was me, Tom, and our Lieutenant Andy Costello. The 3 of us became very close. Tom and I worked on this DNA database for many years. We were exposed to the soot of Ground Zero for those 4 years as we cleaned the various items before returning them to family. We did this in the poorly ventilated basement of Police HQ, built over 50 years ago. We were always talking about more and more friends being diagnosed with cancer, never considering our own mortality, until just a few years later. Cancer took Tom's life in 2021, and a part of my life was taken from me by an unfair, violent disease. My service in the United States Marine Corps was during the Cold War, and I don't know war as it is defined, but I know 9/11. I know Ground Zero. I knew the many, many appreciative people we returned a wedding ring to, and I know cancer. I dare say I know what those who come home from war think, there but for the grace of God. I've been a staunch advocate for the heroes of 9/11 and was intimately involved in the battle to get the James Udroga Act passed in 2010. I gladly left my family numerous times to travel to D.C. with John Field and others to stump the halls of Congress and the Senate, and to tell them my story and the story of Detective Tom Neal. In 2020, a woman called the Feel Good Foundation. She lost her husband on 9/11 and wanted to raise funds for our foundation. She told me how she was lucky to talk to her husband that morning as rescuers tried to get him on the 91st floor. He didn't make it out. The NYPD had called her some years later and returned her husband's credit card, all that was found of him. I keep a copy of the DNA database on my phone, and while she chatted about her husband, I searched. I came to realize it was me who had given her that credit card in 2003. To be sitting there in Commack Starbucks with this same woman over 15 years later was very emotional. Was incredibly emotional for both of us. Very emotional for a lot of different reasons. I do wish I could tell Tom that story, and maybe someday I'll get that chance. For the last 6 years, I've been the recipient of a federal contract to educate responders about the James Udroga Law, and it gives me an opportunity to say out loud what I experienced at Ground Zero, which is an excellent form of therapy. It gives me an opportunity to talk about my hero, Tom Neal, and it also gives me a chance to hear all the stories of responders share with me. Some 90% of responders suffer with some level of PTSD. I am one of that 90%. I love my country and I love my fellow responders, and I urge you to find one of them, if not 100 of them, and thank them for what they did, and pledge your support to them during this and every anniversary of that horrific day.
John Reina shares the memories of another first responder.
I was home when it started. I had just put my 5-year-old daughter Emily on the bus for school, and my wife Susan dropped my 1-year-old son Joey off at my mother-in-law's for the day. My wife called me and asked if I was watching TV. I said no, and she said, "Oh, you didn't know? A plane crashed into the World Trade Center." She knew that I was at the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993 in the Emergency Service Unit. So I turned on the news, and like everyone else that morning, was shocked at the fire coming from the tower. Knowing that this would be a huge job, I got my go bag together, and as I was getting ready to leave, I watched the second plane strike the World Trade Center. In that second, I knew, we all knew, that we were under attack, and that this would be an all-hands-on deck. The drive from my home in Commack to Fort Totten usually takes about 35 to 45 minutes. I made it in about 20 minutes. Cars that pulled off the road to let first responders drive like crazy to get into the city. As I was driving in, I was listening to 1010 WINS News Radio, describing when the tower collapsed. I'll never forget the female reporter's lines, "Oh my God, the tower just fell." We loaded up the A-team trucks and headed into Manhattan. We figured we'd never get into Manhattan through the tunnel, so we went north and crossed the Throgs Neck Bridge. As we were crossing the bridge, the second tower came down. We continued through the Bronx and crossed the Triborough Bridge and took the Harlem River Drive to the FDR Drive and headed south. As we traveled south towards the Staten Island Ferry Terminal, we could see the giant smoke plume from where the towers used to be. There were thousands of people going north on the other side of the FDR, walking in the street like a stream of refugees. When we entered the small tunnel near the Staten Island Ferry, it was a beautiful, bright, sunny day. When we came out on the other side, it was like a bad movie about the end of the world. Dust so thick you could only see about 10 feet. The debris on the ground was like black soot, several feet deep. We drove as far as we could before we couldn't go any further. Vehicles were burning out of control. Fire department, police department, and civilian cars all aflame. As we got closer to the site, there were no more roads visible. We continued on foot into the site. The destruction was complete, biblical in its proportion. Fire and police vehicles that weighed 40 tons were ripped apart and crushed like aluminum beer cans. Communications were down. The repeaters for both the fire department, police department, and other emergency units were in the towers, which were now destroyed. Next to how walkie-talkie phones worked, so we were able to hook up with some other units, make small teams, and begin to look for victims. and help where we could. The unsung heroes of this entire event were union workers. Without them, we would not have been able to do anything in those first few days. Heavy construction equipment that was needed to begin rescue operations miraculously showed up. They were moving debris out of the way for us within hours. As we found our newly formed temporary headquarters and let them know who was still alive, we began to get a sense of the destruction and what horrors awaited us. We knew we had lost people, we just didn't know how many. There was one point during the day, I just saw a list of missing and confirmed dead. There was no doubt this was a wartime event. One of our emergency service guys was literally blown out the front door of the North Tower when it collapsed, and he told us that 2 of our guys were right behind him. Mike Curtin and John D'Alara. I knew these guys. I came into the unit in 1987 with John. Mike and I had rappelled onto the roof of the World Trade Center in 1993 when the first attempt was made to destroy the buildings. 5 of us decided to go looking for them. Steve Hayden, Mike Warmoth, Pete Segretti, Jose Hernandez, and I made our way to what was left of the North Tower, climbing over a pile that is hard to describe. We were crawling over the top of what we thought was an escalator, but it was the elevator engine room on the 110th floor. We saw handprints where people had dragged their hands along the wall looking for a way out. At one point, we found a void into what was left of the parking garage under the towers. We began to crawl into it when suddenly the fire department started hitting their air horns 3 times in a row, which means the building is collapsing. We didn't know which building was coming down, but we knew we had to get the hell out of there right now. Pete and Jose were in the void, and Steve was coming up and out. I told them to get out and that I would wait for Pete and Jose. They looked at me like I was nuts, and Big Steve said, "No, we are all getting out together, but we all die here together. Steve and Mike are Marines, and don't leave people behind." We got Pete and Jose out and began to run, just as building number 7 was collapsing. We didn't look back, we didn't hear it, we felt it in our souls, pushing us down the block as we made a turn to Stuyvesant High School. The blast flew by us. Miraculously, no one was killed when number 7 collapsed. This is just one story out of a 9-month ordeal that thousands of first responders were part of. There were thousands of acts of heroism that will never be recorded or acknowledged. I know that the actions of Steve and Mike, along with Pete and Jose, will be with me forever. I will say this, it was one of the few times in my career that I was truly frightened. Anyone who says anything different either wasn't there or is full of shit. We were scared, but we went anyway. It's who we are, it's what we do. I remember finally getting through to my wife and having to tell her that 2 of the guys that were at our wedding were killed, and that I wasn't sure about anything. Seeing armed fighters flying low over Manhattan, we did know this was our Pearl Harbor. The ensuing weeks and months on the pile and in the pit at Ground Zero have had a lasting effect on me. Of all the events I've been involved in, whatever the role, the event will be a defining moment not only in the national memory, but certainly in mine and my family's for generations to come. Joe Zogby, New York Police Department, Emergency Service Unit, retired.
The goalie